Hi, folks. Today, I want to start off by telling you a bit of a story, probably unsurprising after a lot of the storytelling we've heard about. But before I do, I just want to set some context. Don't worry if you can't read the slides. There's nothing on them that I'm not going to cover in what I say. There's no animation if that's a problem for you, and there's no video that you'll have to see or anything like that. And there's also only 2 colors. If you can't differentiate color, you're not going to miss anything here. Since it is after lunch, I, of course, have to ask folks a show of hands if this scenario sounds familiar to you. Several incidents have been happening for a while now. Everyone knows the outcome's bad. Of course, we'd prefer not to have the incidents, but the outcome's bad. We don't want it. There's some data, especially counting and categorization around the incidents. And maybe there's even a mandate to reduce the number of these negative outcomes. Does that sound familiar to anyone, by show of hands? Most of us, right? I think that this is very common. We've heard a little bit about metrics and about some of these things. And so I'm going to address this from a different perspective. We've talked a little bit, the theme of this conference is about what SRE could be. My vision for SRE is one where we look at what creates success just as much or perhaps more than we look at failure. When we think about metrics and things like that, really, if we think about the state our system is in most of the time, we're actually more successful than not, right? The outages, the incidents, they make these really powerful stories because they don't happen that often. As much as it's sort of a common track, and we had the outage track here, and as much as we like talking about it, it's really, folks in this room today operating their systems that are creating success and allowing these systems to be safe every day. So that's my vision for SRE, and it's also one in which we learn from other disciplines. As we've heard about other sources, we heard about the James Webb Telescope, we've heard about safety science from some folks. I want an SRE where we translate these things from other domains, where we don't just import things wholesale, we don't just do something because some book, won't say which book, some book says we should. Whether it's another domain, someone's new book, something like that. I want one where we translate whatever it is into our local context. I want us as SREs to be context sensitive, to have an understanding and ability to interpret and understand what might or might not work in our systems with our constraints. So that said, I'm going to talk to you about rock fishing. That sounds pretty natural, right? No? Okay. Well, before I had started researching this, I'd never heard of this, but rock fishing is a sport very common in Australia. It's one in which fishers go out on these rocks that jut into the ocean, hence rock fishing. This way, they can reach very deep water, and they get to fish for all kinds of new exotic fish, and this lets them be successful at fishing without having to take a boat and drive around and do all these things. The problem is that it is often said to be Australia's most deadly sport. Between 2004 and 2018, there are 164 reported drownings related to rock fishing. So as a result, the government took some of their data. They had some data on it from coroners around the country. It did what a lot of our incident reports do, a lot of our dashboards do. It said, hey, there's about 200 incidents, okay? We know the time period, we know the number, should all be familiar for us. And it said, actually, we've now also categorized this data into approximately these 5 categories. Every incident falls into one of these categories. We've seen similar setups here, I think from Meta and some other folks saying that these are our sort of leading causes of incidents. So from that perspective, these are our leading causes of incidents here. From this data, it comes into, in this order, inexperience, overtopping waves, slips and falls, freak waves, and unknown. What happened with this data is they were able to take it look at it, and at the same time, the media has been sort of covering this and talking about the risk that when you're out on a rock and you're fishing, a wave comes up over and sweeps you off the rock into the ocean. And so with this data and that kind of media pressure, there is a mandate for the governments to do something. And what they have a goal to do, not quite an OKR, is actually to reduce the number of these drownings by 50% in the next few years. So they look at this and they say, well, their experience comes from this data and beaches and things like that. And so they apply the solution that is familiar to them. They say, now everyone who goes rock fishing, they pass a special law, you have to wear a life jacket. Sounds reasonable, certain distance. I mean, you're near the water, life jackets are supposed to help you, right? So the problem is that that's not actually going to help that many people. Fortunately, there was a group of researchers who follow a practice called, or a research method called naturalistic decision-making. If you've seen decision-making studies before, you may have heard of them. Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman are some of the big ones. You may hear that, people are irrational, they decide things in this way, or they function in this other way, and there are all these little tricks that you can do to people's minds. The problem with these studies is that they're kind of useless for the work that we do. We can't really take those studies and we can't really apply them to the work that we do day to day with the people we work with, the type of work we face, because what they're doing is they're taking apart these kind of decision scenarios and they're finding some tiny little bit. And then they're getting a bunch of students and paying them like $20 to come sit in and take this little toy test. And so what that means is that really we don't work like that, or at least I don't. I hope none of you do. As Laura Nolan pointed out earlier, they're using a model, right? And because if it were identical to the real world, it would be the same as the real world. In the scenarios she gave, that was a bad thing. In this scenario, we said, well, if the models aren't useful, they're too far divided, and an identical thing would be the real world, why don't we just look in the real world? And that's fortunately what naturalistic decision-making researchers did. So they went and they said, we need a mix of sort of qualitative and quantitative data. We heard about this from Lauren on the first day. We can't just use our quantitative data in order to see what we want to see, learn what we want to learn. As you saw, we had quite a bit of quantitative data. We knew how many people, we knew how many years, we knew what the categories were. I didn't put it on the slide, but we even knew what percentage breakdowns there were into the different categories. There were a lot of numbers that we could sort of extract from this and in a typical way, and they're data-driven, and they made a decision. But they were lacking the qualitative data. They weren't able to actually see what was helping these fishers create safety. If you notice, even though that is, we want none of these lives lost, but if you notice that year period, it wasn't every year. It was a number of years. And yet this is a popular sport, so that tells us that just like you folks who are operating systems and keeping them safe and intervening, perhaps even before there's disaster, fishers are doing something in order to help create safety every day. And to understand what that is, and to understand what an appropriate intervention might or might not be, what we can do, say, after an incident, what might be useful, we need to understand what work is actually going on, what is the experience of those people, what is it that they're battling with. And so with that, they actually went out and they talked to a bunch of fishers. They divided them up into two groups. It happened to work out pretty nicely that it was half and half. For their purposes, at first they said, well, about half of them have 3 years or more of experience. They said that's a pretty good proxy for saying that you're an experienced fisher. You've been at this for a few years now. And what they did is they asked these fishers, they said, can you look at this data, the same data that the government had, and tell us a little bit about it. And already just by talking to them, if you remember that category that we saw, unknown, that was actually a pretty big category of them. They just had no idea. They had no idea what happened. But right off the bat, taking these folks who had been doing this for a number of years, they're able to say, you know, I'm almost certain that is people fishing alone. Because when they fish alone and they're at risk, no one is there to intervene, no one is there to help them. That is likely a big contributor to those unknowns. So already by adding these folks who were actually doing the work and who were near it, they already got this additional insight. And that's what I'm going to show throughout this. There are these techniques we can build up, and we can start to glean these other pictures and other pieces of the puzzle and start to fill them in. They also asked them to say, okay, well, those 5 categories aside, you as experienced people, how would you categorize it? What have you seen? What have you experienced? And they had a slightly different categorization, as you can see. They said, well, folks are inexperienced. They actually saw that as a risk in and of itself. And interestingly, they didn't define experience or inexperience the way the government did and the way this data set did. Inexperience for most folks was, again, number of years. But they said, really, the number of years you've been at this is somewhat helpful, but it turns out what really matters is how familiar are you with the site you're fishing at. There's a handful of these around the country. They're all very different. This is a lot like us. There's SRE all over the place now. We get to come together here and across the world, but if you notice throughout these days, we rarely can agree on what SRE is. And so in the same vein, they said, well, experience matters a lot as far as your familiarity with the site that you're actually at. Because if you're not familiar with the site, you might stand on this rock in a dangerous place. But someone who's been there knows, oh, the waves come up over. And I think we've all had this experience where maybe we're new on a team, we open something up, and someone says, maybe we open a PR, and they say, oh, that's a really dangerous area. Let me check something before I approve this PR. And these fishers had the same thing. They characterized inexperience as a lack of familiarity with the specific area. They were also able to tell these researchers that actually swimming back when you fell off the rock was actually a hazard. And so if we think about what the government did, passing this law to make you wear a life jacket, this seems a little bit strange. You might think, okay, well, you fall in the ocean, you have a life jacket, you're afloat, you swim back to where you are, right? Well, it turns out that with the wave pattern and with everything there, exiting the water is really, really difficult. Even with a life jacket, it can be really hard to be able to get out of the water. The right thing to do, these fishers tell us, is to actually swim away. As soon as you hit the water, swim somewhere else. Find an easier place to get back up there, and then come around. If you stay near the rock and you continue to try to get back aboard that rock, you're unlikely to do so. They also saw people go close to the edge. They'd go to the edge. They'd maybe had an especially large fish they were battling with, or they had some sort of line that was snagged, and they would reach over, and they wouldn't be able to see anymore the wave pattern that was happening, and they might be swept away. They, of course, didn't know everything, so they also had their own categories of unknown as well. So they, of course, said even in the case of the unknown, it was, again, probably fishing alone. But we learned that these were experts. The government meant well, but they didn't necessarily know more than these fishers about those local conditions. I'm sure they have all sorts of experts, all sorts of people, but if you remember what the data set was that they drew most of their data from, it was from data from coroners across Australia. And what this meant was that folks had produced this data in a medical context. They were answering questions, filling in their incident metrics in the context of what was relevant to them as medical practitioners. That's not necessarily useful to us or to the fishers or those close to the systems. It doesn't necessarily tell us what we can do to help create safety. So they did the radical thing of ask them what they do. And it turns out that actually, most fishers said if there was any one piece of equipment, sure, they said life jackets are good. Don't get me wrong. They said if you're not a great swimmer, life jackets should help you if you're not very good at swimming. But really, what they pointed to is they have these special cleats they wear, and they have these spikes on them, and they help them cling to the rocks so they don't get swept away in the first place, ideally. There's actually this intervention available to them before they even think about whether or not you enter the water. And again, I think that's the same for all of us. We all likely have these, we might call them tips or tricks, all these things from hard-won experience that we do that's probably not in the docs. It's probably not, written down. Maybe we teach a new team member. All these things that we do in advance of some sort of event before we reach some sort of state. We do all these interventions because we have that expertise that we can come to bear. And again, they also said, we focus on swimming away. So those were their tools that the government, it wasn't represented in that data. If you notice, there was nothing in that data that told us about how we might improve that. If you were a new fisher and you looked at that data, there was nothing telling you, you should probably go get cleats along with your life jacket. There was nothing telling you should probably figure out how to stay on that rock first. And so what we need are these multiple perspectives. Without that, we really can't get a clear picture. Every view that we take, it's going to highlight some things, and it's going to obscure others. For example, they even asked the fishers they said, there are these weather warnings. What do you do with the weather warnings? And there was a fisher, I think his name was Sam in the literature, and he says, those weather warnings are actually kind of useless. And the researchers were, naturally surprised because if the issue is waves, then why wouldn't you care about the weather? Well, it turns out, again, at the perspective of the government, what they're doing is they're kind of taking a satellite view and they're looking from overhead and they're looking at these rocky areas. And they'll say, there's some big waves today in area X, you might want to stay away. Turns out that's not enough information for the fishers. They can't act on that. It's meaningless to them. Because while it's true that there might be, very high waves, they could be over there behind me, and there could be a cliff up there. So, of course, today on very high waves, I'm not going to go fish up on that cliff. But that doesn't tell me anything about the conditions in front of me, because the government had primarily been giving weather reports around the whole area. It wasn't sensitive, their solution, to the context that the fishers needed. And it was actually very misleading. And a lot of our metrics can be the same way. They said it was dangerous, but it was potentially safe. Conversely, if there wasn't a wave warning, but I'm up here near the edge, that doesn't necessarily make it safe either. These metrics allowed them to be misled, so from their perspective, the safest thing that they could do was dismiss them. Just ignore it. It doesn't really apply to them. Now, at this point, it might sound like what I'm saying is we should ignore the government or middle, upper, whatever management. This applies in this metaphor. And that's not what I'm saying. We do need that perspective. In this case, what it highlighted was that even though those fishers talked about the danger of fishing alone, when they looked at it, actually more experienced fishers had drowned fishing by themselves than inexperienced fishers, despite their warning that you shouldn't do that. But this wasn't visible to the fishers themselves. Of course, they're either on their own or they're not on their own, so they don't see this. It turns out that likely inexperienced folks, they don't want to fish by themselves. Experienced folks perhaps get overconfident and they think they don't need help. So then they fish by themselves. So each of these perspectives are able to tell us a lot more about what's really happening. And it also opens up the options about what we might be able to do to intervene. We could, instead of mandating life jackets, we might mandate the cleats. We might make it so that it's really easy to find other fishers to fish with. We might fund some clubs or programs so that new fishers are always with experienced fishers. Some sort of embedded model, perhaps you've heard of that. But really, we can do all of this too. If this all sounds a bit complicated, you don't have several hundred people to go talk to. We don't have to run a really formal academic study. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that. We don't actually have to do that. That is not on the thing. If you remember the big list from Alex's talk of the things that SRE does, formal academic study was not on it, so we don't have to do it. And when we don't do it, we still benefit, though. But what we can do is talk to the people who are closest to the work. In many cases, that's going to be us, our peers. That doesn't mean that we can't talk to them. That should make it easier. Sometimes it's going to be responders, depending on how your company's set up. As we heard from Dave before, I think it was on day one, that not just SRE should be on call. So there should be responders who are not SRE that we could be talking to. We can ask them about their experience. And when they tell us, we can echo back the story that we heard. We can make sure that we have it right. We can say, okay, so such and such happened. That's what is difficult, or that's what made it confusing. Is that right? And they can tell us if that's right or not right. We don't have to produce a paper at the end in order for this to be valid. If we learn something, we could drop it in Slack, share it with your team, whatever the case may be. Whatever you do with this insight that you gain is up to you. You don't have to produce any one specific artifact. I will say that you should share whatever that insight that you gain is, though. But I do want to suggest that when you do ask folks about what they're doing, I don't think we need more why questions. Oftentimes when we ask folks why, from our perspective, we might hear that we're intensely curious, right? SRE, we're supposed to approach from a sense of curiosity. But so often, why triggers sort of a defensive response. Why can be heard as justifying. And there's actually some research that says, we don't actually, we're not machines, so the way our brain works when we're asked why is we don't kind of rewind our mental tape and then examine it like a play by play and then answer you with why. What we do is we reconstruct the scenario in our mind, essentially guess at why, and tell you that. So instead, I'm going to suggest some other questions. You may hear these as how questions. These are from Sidney Decker's book, The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And they're things like, when you were doing this, were you reminded of anything you've experienced before? Did it seem familiar? What were the limitations? What constraints did you have? You might hear that, we couldn't have any downtime, or this customer was going to be really upset at us, so we knew we had to fix this quick, or it happened to be during the holiday period, so we knew that this, there was a lot on the line, or it was actually when a bunch of people were taking vacation, so there were only 2 of us. You can ask people, are there any rules, procedures that you normally do that applied here? Folks might tell you, yeah. Every time I see this, it's kind of weird. We kick over the service. Works all the time until it didn't. How did the world look to them at the time? Can let folks interpret that. It looked normal to me, but perhaps it wasn't. Or it looked strange, something I'd never seen before. All of that can be useful information. It tells you more about all those categories. If you think back to those unknown or those inexperienced categories, if we were to say at the end of an incident, it's because someone was inexperienced, that wouldn't make sense. What does that even mean? Does that mean that in a few years, once we're all a lot more experienced SREs, that means the incidents go away, right? Because inexperience was the problem, right? But instead, if we know, we were under time pressure or resource constraints, or other things, and that's what made this difficult, or these tools we had, really helped us sort of look the wrong way or misled us. All of those things can be a lot more useful for us to understand what's happening. And so I'm going to suggest that you try these questions yourself, give them a shot. At the end here, I will have a link to my slides and a few other resources, the paper itself, if you're into that sort of thing, but also a link to where you can find kind of a little cheat sheet, get some of these questions for yourself. You'll be able to see these, and if you're wondering how you go about asking these, it's really up to you. If your culture is one that you operate in Slack, ask these things in Slack. I do think there's chances where if you're in a higher fidelity sort of conversation, say Zoom or something else, or even in person, you might get other responses. But really, the data that you're going to get, the information you're going to get about what actually happened is going to be so valuable that even when you're constrained by having to do asynchronous Slack because you're on the other side of the world, you're still going to get information, and especially when you use some of the how and experiential questions, you're going to get information that you've probably never heard before. In most organizations, no one has asked a lot of folks about what it was like. This might be a bit new to them. They might be a little bit surprised that anyone cares. You might have to reassure them that you're not there to get them in trouble. You honestly want to know about what their experience was like, because that's how little most folks get to be heard about this stuff. And so when folks hear that you're curious about this, you really want to know what unfolded, that you understand how complex these incidents are, how difficult it can be to make sense of these things in the moment at 3 a.m. with a crying child of varying ages. They will often open up to you and tell you more stuff than any of your metrics, any of those numbers ever could. And so here are some of the references. URL there is going to get you the slides and get you some of the links. But that's it. And if you folks have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.